Hello everybody, this is Christian from Germany. In this video I will show you something about the very aggressive and funny Deutz Gambit. The reason for my video is I think the Deutz Gambit is one of the strongest openings against players below 2000 points. I think you can crush your opponents very quickly. The Deutz Gambit arises after the moves pawn to e4, pawn to e5, knight to f3, knight to c6, then we have bishop to c4 and bishop to c5. And this is the standard position of the Italian game. And here we should castle on the king side, and now black has two choices. At first knight to f6, which is by far the most often played move, and the other choice is pawn to d6 perhaps. If he plays a move like pawn to d6, I can recommend following continuation with pawn to c3 and pushing pawn to d4. And I would say white is gaining some space and control in the center and will have a really comfortable game. So by far the most often played move for black is here knight to f6. And then the Deutz Gambit will gonna start here with pawn to d4. And white is gambiting the whole pawn here, and black is gonna have only one good choice, and this is the unnatural move bishop takes d4. Any other move will lead for some very critical and dangerous positions for black. And now I'm gonna show you how this is working. At first, we're gonna have a look for the worst scenario for black. A really bad move, for example, is to capture the d4 pawn with the knight. And if this will happen, you should immediately capture e5 pawn. And now you can see the big weakness in this position, and this is the f7 pawn. And here I can show you how you can trick your opponent after these three natural moves. The most obvious move which can be played for black is definitely castle on the king's side. But against this, at first you play the quiet bishop to e3, you're pinning the knight, knight has to go out from this pin, and then you just grab the knight on e6, and he cannot take back with the pawn because the bishop is hanging. So he has to forcefully capture the bishop. And after this you give this check on f7, and then king goes to h8, and then bishop retreats back to the b3. So the f7 will be the weak square. For example, bishop retreats, and then you can jump in with some check. And after rook takes, bishop takes, you are a healthy exchange up, and you have much better position with white. Also, a really logical move here is to retreat the knight back to the e6, And then you can just capture the knight, and after f captures, you play the simple knight to d3 and attack the bishop. And wherever this bishop goes, for example, back to e7 is the best option here. You just kick this knight away. This is really important. For example, knight to d5 and then queen to f3. And now black cannot castle on the king side, and the queen side from black is not developed, and he's not prepared to castle on the queen side. So this is a really dangerous and difficult position for black now. For example, the logical rook to f8 is coming, then you give this check with the queen, and rook to f7, you just grab this pawn. And this is really hard to defend this position as black. The last possibility or logical move to stop attacking on the f7 is the move pawn to d5. After this, you just grab the pawn, and when the knight takes back, this is a big mistake because black will lose a piece. For example, let's have a look at this knight captures on d5. You just played a simple pawn to c3. And when the knight moves, for example to c6, you're just a whole piece up. You're attacking the knight on d5 twice. So this is also losing for black. Another very bad choice for black is to retreat the bishop to the b6. I will just give you an example. You simply capture the e5 pawn, and after knight takes on e4, you play the tricky and the winning move, queen to d5. You're attacking the knight. On the other hand, you're threatening checkmate on f7. So this is just losing for black. Now let's have a look for the by far most often played move here, and this is really important to know this line. After e captures on d5, you should exactly know what you're doing, and then you should push this pawn and attacking the knight. The most often played move is pawn to d5, and another variation goes with knight to g4. At first we're looking for the pawn to d5 line. Then you should just grab the knight on f6, and after d takes on c4. If you are white, the best choice, if the e file is open, to play rook to e1 immediately. Another choice which looks really good is not really good. For example, f takes on g8. Your opponent can just play rook to g8, and this pawn will be under attack, and this is not really the best way to go for white. The best continuation, I will promise you, is play rook to e1. And the most natural move here, of course, is to play bishop to e6. Whenever bishop is coming to e6, you should just immediately attack this bishop with knight to g5. This position contains a lot of tricks, and I think it is pretty simple to find these tricks with white. But on the other hand, it is really hard to defend for black. At first, I will show you the main idea with the move, for example, queen to d7. After that, you can just capture this bishop, and queen cannot recapture because he's losing the queen, of course. So he has to forcefully take with the f-pawn, but then you give this check with the queen, and he's gonna lose the whole piece. So this is the main idea of this variation. The next move black can try, for example, is the move queen to d6, which seems really logical because this trick I showed you before is not working. But the continuation at first is the same. You just take the bishop, and after forcefully f captures on e6, then you just give not this check on h5, no, you just grab this pawn on g7. So rook has forcefully go to the g8, and then you give this check with the queen, and when the king goes to the d7, you have the simple continuation knight to d2 and knight to e4. And black can do nothing against this. I give you a short example. Knight goes to d2. What can black play? For example, the best move is to push pawn to d3, but then you can go with knight to e4. You're attacking the queen and you're attacking the bishop twice, and he's losing the whole piece. So this is just losing for black too. The next obvious choice for black is to capture the f-pawn with the queen. But then we have exactly the same trick. We just take the bishop, and after the forcefully f takes, you have this queen check, and he's just losing the bishop. So same trick, and white is winning. When your opponent tries to save the king on the king's side, this is of course a really bad move, but I will show you how you can manage and finish your opponent really quickly. After castle on the king's side, you just grab the pawn on g7. And after this, the rook is under attack and has to go to the e8, and then you just play queen to h5, and you're threatening checkmate on h7. After that, it is important to defend the h7 for black. So bishop goes to the f5, but then I would say the most of your opponent will overlook this. Queen captures on f7, and it is also checkmate. This is just losing after castle on the king's side. Let's go for the last variation, and this is kind of different like the tricks before. And this goes after queen to d5. After this, you play the surprising move knight to c3. Your opponent cannot capture the knight because after queen takes on d5 and you're just winning the whole queen because the bishop is pinned. So this is not possible. The best and only good move for black here is queen to f5. After this knight has to be moved because it is under attack, so knight to e4. Now black has a really logical move here, and logical move is g captures on f6. But if he captures this pawn, you can go for big advantage with white. And you have this tricky move with pawn to g4. Queen, of course, cannot capture, because after queen captures and bishop captures, you can win the bishop here. So the queen has to retreat. For example, the first square is queen to d5, but this is immediately losing. After knight to f6, you have this check and winning the whole queen. So the second option for black is to play queen to e5, but then you just play knight to f3, and this queen is gone here. So the last option, for example, is queen to g6, but that will also lose the whole piece. After knight takes on e6, f takes, and knight takes on c5, white is just the whole piece up. The next logical looking move and a little bit better move is castle on the queen side. But after this, you can also push pawn to g4. The most obvious looking choice for black is to take this with the queen, and after queen captures, bishop captures, you play the tricky move knight takes on f7, and white is better. The second bad option for black is to retreat the knight to the g6, because you can just grab the bishop on e6, and after f takes, you just take the g7 pawn, and after rook has to forcefully move here to the g8, you just grab this bishop, and white is a whole piece up. The last option I will show you is queen to d5. But then you can capture the g-pawn, and the rook has to forcefully move to the g8. Then you can play knight to f6. You're hitting the queen and the rook. For example, queen to d6. But then you play another good move, and this is knight to e4, attacking the queen again. Queen can retreat, but then you just grab the rook, and after rook takes, you just play bishop to g5, attacking the queen again. And now here is no square where the queen can go for, and you can always capture the bishop to c5. So this is also just winning for white. Let's go back into the main position of the Deutz Gambit. Let's have a look when e takes on d4, pawn to e5, and not pawn to d5. That's what we're looking for. The other logical move from black is knight to g4, and then we reached another main position in the Deutz Gambit. And first time you can go to the max length attack with bishop to f4, which is already a good possibility for white. On the other hand, here's a more secret and I think a more strong move, and this is pawn to c3. This is challenging the whole structure from black. Okay, at first I will show you why I don't like the max length attack too much. For example, bishop to f4, castle on the king's side, then pawn to h3, knight has to retreat to the h6, then we just take this knight, pawn takes, then we play pawn to c3. For example, d6, c takes on d4, bishop retreats, and knight to c3. So this is a standard position in the max length attack, and I would say practically it is not really clear that white has only the attack and the advantage, and I think this position gives black also a chance for some counterattacks. You can see this on the arrows. King can escape to this very safe black diagonal, and yes, I don't like to play this variation too much. After knight to g4, I would say the strongest continuation I can definitely recommend you is to play pawn to c3. This is challenging the whole structure from black. And to take the pawn on c3 is not really good because black is only developing white pieces. So here are a lot of obvious and logical choices, and all of them I will show you how to punish them. Let's start with castle on the king side, for example, but then you just grab the pawn in the center of the board, and this gives you a great advantage here. Bishop has to retreat, and then you play the tricky bishop to g5. He cannot play pawn to f6 because the bishop is here, so he forcefully has to defend the queen with knight to e7. And then you just kick this knight away. Knight has only one square left, h6. Then you just develop the knight. And for example, this knight wants to come back into the game, but then you kick this knight away. He has to go back to the h6. And then you jump in with knight to d5. And you can see this knight is gone because he cannot attack, he cannot defend. Yes, the queen is hanging, and this position is definitely losing for black. Now I will show you the next logical move, how you can punish them. And this is knight takes on e5. After that, you should just grab this knight, and after knight takes, rook to e1. This looks really dangerous. Pawn to d6 doesn't work, or pawn to f6 doesn't work anyways, because you just grab the d pawn and you're just a piece up. So this is not possible for black. The only response black has is to play queen to e7. This looks really dangerous. Pawn to f4 doesn't work because the black has the discover check here with this pawn. So this is not working, f4. This is really important to remember. But you just have another very, very, very strong move. And this is the crushing move, pawn to b4. Bishop has to retreat. And then you just take this pawn. And after bishop takes, queen takes, and knight to f3 with the tricky check here, you just take this knight, queen takes, king to g2, and the queen takes the bishop on c1. After this position, you just can keep smile, because after the next move, the black queen is out of the game, because you just play knight to d2, blocks this escape diagonal for the black queen. The queen is also attacked and has to retreat to a3, but then here comes the winning move, and this is the sacrifice of the bishop. Bishop takes on f7. And after king takes and queen f4 check, you have some very forced continuation, and this is just winning 100%. I just play a few moves with the computer, and you can see how easy white's position is. So king goes anywhere, rook comes into the game. He plays just a move, rook gives this check, then queen check, rook takes, here check, and checkmate. And you can see this is a very, very strong trap where you can have a forced checkmate for your opponent. Now, the next obvious choice from black is to play pawn to d6. But after that, you can remember, if you can take the d4 pawn, just do this. We take the d4 pawn, and then we have a forced continuation after knight takes, and pawn takes on e5. Then we just give this check with the queen, and the most obvious move is to block this with the bishop. And then you just sacrifice the bishop on f7, king takes, queen gives this check, and you're gaining the black bishop. And I would say, if you look at this position, white is doing much better, because black has lost the castle right, the king is hanging in the first rank in the middle, and this is much more easy to play for white. The last variation we're going to talk about is the very logical looking move pawn to d5. And this is also the main move here in this variation. And then you should just take this pawn with en passant to open up the e-file. And after bishop takes, you play rook to e1. And black has to defend the king, knight to e7. And then you should just kick this knight away. And after knight to f6, you play bishop to g5. And now black is facing some problems, perhaps to get this double pawn on the f-file. For example, he tries to open up the f-file with pawn to h6. But then you just take this knight, and after pawn takes, queen takes. If you look at this position, this is much better for black. The f6 is hanging and cannot be defended because this knight is also hanging because of the rook on e1, and this is a very easy one for white. Let's have a look at the main line, and the main line starts with bishop takes on d4, and then we have knight takes, and here are two variations where you can go for. The main line is by far to play pawn to f4, and the second option you have is to play the tricky bishop to g5. And I would say you can try both of them and can look how your opponent reacts on this. At first, we're gonna have a look for bishop to g5. After that, perhaps your opponent comes to mind that he is not castled on the king side and he can run with these pawns and crush your king. Perhaps pawn to h6, bishop retreats, and then pawn to g5 is now a mistake because you can play the tricky pawn to f4. And for example, here is taking the bishop, you just take the f-pawn. And if you look carefully at this position, both of the knights are hanging, and this is just over for black. Let's have a look for the main line, and the main line starts with the move pawn to f4. And the funny thing is knight to c6 doesn't work, and I will show you that. For example, he plays knight to c6, but then you can sacrifice the bishop on f7 after king takes, pawn takes. This knight is gone, except this knight takes on e5, and that will be the try from black. So queen goes to d5, give this check, this knight is already pinned, king has to go away, queen takes on e5 check, queen to e7, and queen takes on c7. And if you look at the position, pawn structure on black's queen side is destroyed, king has lost the castle right, and this position is much better now for white. In this position, there's just one correct move where black can play, and this is pawn to d6. But then you just take this pawn, then d takes on e5, and bishop to g5. This is all standard stuff, and all of this contains to the main line. And now here are a few continuations and logical moves and mainline moves, and I will show you how you can manage this very good. At first, I can show you a really funny trick after the move bishop to g4. This is a move which is, I think, a really strong move if you don't know this trick here. And the trick now starts with the bishop sacrifice on f7, and after king takes, you just take this knight, this bishop. The knight on f6 is pinned because of the rook on f1. So, for example, I will show you how the game can continue. Knight takes on c2, threatening to take the rook, but then you just give this check with the queen, and after the retreat from the king, you just take this knight, pawn takes, and knight to c3. Don't care about the rook on a1, because your opponent is definitely capture rook on a1. And then you can jump in with the knight and can hold another piece into the game. And the big weakness will be the f6 pawn. You will see that. I just play a few moves with the computer and you can see how to punish black's position. So, after this few moves, we can see that the f6 pawn is very, very weak. And after the next few moves, you can see that the position is completely over and won for white. After, for example, rook to e1, e8, you just give this check with the rook. And the king has no square left, so forcefully queen has to take this rook and you just give this check with the queen. And then I show you a very simple continuation how you can finish the game. Okay, if you reach this position, congratulations, you're a very good player and you have mastered this position. This is completely winning for white. Now, very important line you have to know, and this is the most often played line here, and this is bishop to e6. After bishop to e6, you have to remember defend your bishop with knight to a3. This is the most active square for the knight. And then here comes the theoretical move, and I will promise you that will come queen to e7. The queen wants to go to the c5 square, and he wants to go for some discover checks after moving the knight away on d4. So what we have to do is to chase this knight away, and we do this with pawn to c3. But if knight retreats to c6, that will be not really common variation for black. So I think your opponent knows about this and he will capture the bishop on c4. But before we recapture, we take the knight on f6, and after pawn takes, knight takes, you just will play queen to c5, I think. But then we just take this knight, and after queen takes, rook to c1, and queen takes on a2, you can see that the queen is not really active in this game, and your rook can take the pawn on the 7th rank, and now he's very well placed. I will show you some moves now. For example, queen captures on b2, and then you just grab the pawn on f6. And here comes a very forced variation. Queen takes on d4, queen takes, pawn takes, and rook captures on f7. Okay, this is, if you reach this position, this is really common for white here. Because, for example, after rook to g8, you play the simple pawn to g3. The king runs into the middle of the board and is catching this pawn. And also, black can go wrong very, very quickly. And now I will show you that. For example, rook to b8, he wants to run with this pawn. And then you play the move he wants to play, king to f1 or f2, and then he plays the losing move, for example, rook to f8. I give you 5 seconds to find definitely the winning move for white. Okay, the winning move is rook to e7 check. And after the king has to retreat, you just take this rook, and after king takes, rook takes, this is just winning for white. Let's have a look for the main variation. And this is definitely the strongest variation where black can try, and this is a refuting system, I would say this. I have to say this. And this strong system starts with queen to e7. And then we play either knight to a3, defending this bishop because black has a threat queen on c5. And discover checks with moving the knight away. Okay, black plays the next move, and this is the next mainline move, rook to g8. And whenever the rook is facing the king on the e-file, this is really important to play king to h1. The queen has the little move to e1 and to f2, and the plan is to play c3. So that are the options for white here, and this is really forced, I would say. Okay, let's have a look. king to h1, bishop to d7, preparing castle on the queen side. Then you just play queen to e1, castle on the queen side, queen to f2, and bishop to e6. If you reach this position, I think, yes, your chances are not the best, because your opponent knows the system very, very good. And this is also the refuting system, I say this. Okay, I will show you how the main line would continues, and this is rook to e1. And if your opponent finds one of these two moves, king to b8 or pawn to a6, which is the main move, I would say this is much better for black here. I analyzed all positions and all variations, and this is kind of hopeless if your opponent plays this correctly. Okay, but against this, I have found a little trick you can try if you reached this difficult position. And the trick starts with, after, for example, pawn to a6, the trick starts with pawn to c3, chasing the knight away. Knight has to retreat to c6. And then at first you play queen to e2. Queen and bishop are attacking this a6 pawn. So another move, for example, your opponent tries pawn to h6. Your trap is gonna work for 100%, and this is really cool. If your opponent plays now king to b8, okay, this is really bad for you. But I will show you how the trap is gonna work. The trap works after pawn to h6. And then you just, at first, take this knight on f6, and after pawn takes, you play this bishop sacrifice on a6. And after pawn takes, queen takes with a check, I will show you just some moves with the computer and how you're gaining some advantage. King goes to d7. Rook comes here, comes in, then queen takes with a check, bishop takes, pawn, and queen takes the pawn. And if you see, you have all the 3 pawns on the queen side, and this is much better now for white. I think this is the only chance to come back into the game if your opponent falls in this trick, because in all other variations it is really hard for white to play this. Okay, that was all I would say you in this video. I hope you liked it. I hope you can use this for your own repertoire, or can gain some tricks for that. And thank you for watching. Bye bye.